what we wanted to look at is what underlies some of these constraints and limitations that prevents evidence from becoming embedded in policy and practice, and also examples where it has occurred successfully and what was the constellation of factors that tended to lead towards solid evidence becoming integrated into policy and development practice. So it was both to understand the constraints and try to tease out some of the variables that were present in positive experiences. So what we found, we did in the end over 250 interviews between speaking with experts and then in the 8 case studies. And there was definitely patterns. What we saw was the constraints and the barriers to incorporating good evidence into policy and practice was significantly grew out of the different stakeholders involved, from researchers to policymakers to practitioners and funders, that the incentives, the timelines, the organizational constraints and opportunities were significantly different. So whereas researchers are incentivized to do rigorous short-term studies that can be published in peer-reviewed journals and ultimately lead to positive tenure decisions, policymakers are subject to an election cycle and very strict budgeting requirements, and practitioners want to make what will work on the ground better.
So what another way of describing what Tony's mentioning is what we found in the unsuccessful cases is a pattern. And that's how most people tend to talk about this. They imagine evidence as kind of like this, we call it the waterfall model, which is evidence is produced by some experts, quote unquote, who tend to be academics or evidence producers. And the idea is that this evidence that is assumed to be kind of abstract knowledge, that if you read it in a paper, you'll understand it. The idea is that somebody will translate this evidence into the context for what it should be applied, and then that translator will then bring it down to the policymaker or policy designer, who will then bring it down to the implementer, right? And so the idea is that it should be this waterfall model. Rather than there being kind of a handoff, it has to be an integrated process. And so let's jointly identify what we know and what we don't know, the different types of evidence that we're going to need to answer the different types of questions across the length of the process.
And to take the time to design a program and say, this is what we don't know about, so this is what we have to collect now. So let's do an iteration or two, gather the evidence from the ground, from the researcher study, from the policy perspective, make the changes we need to, and in this ongoing collaboration, bring our currencies of exchange together in the service of addressing the underlying problem.
There's a really interesting program in South Africa that was an intervention to help reduce unemployment rates also for young males, especially for young males. For young people in general, but especially for young males. And rather than have this waterfall model of have some researchers do the research and then have the government try to translate it and have the implementers try to actually make it happen, they all convene from the beginning. In this kind of joint design of the intervention, they were able to very quickly generate very, very useful information about what kinds of things actually work within our labor centers to improve the situation for these unemployed young people, and what things don't work and why. And so through this first intervention, they learn a lot that they then jointly expanded into a second larger intervention and so forth and so on. But it was always done through this iterative process of everybody working together to design interventions that would start from the realities, but also generate the best knowledge possible.
So it was very intentionally designed to say, how can we make sure that the irreducible needs of each constituency are actually met? And then there's ongoing benefits. The researchers established relationships with the government, which have continued to additional collaborations around other issues on unemployment.